Emily Carter pressed her fingers against her bottom lip and felt the split open again. 3 years. 3 years of learning how to bleed quietly. She stood at the kitchen window of the Hargrove mansion and watched the summer morning come up gold over the Bitterroot Range, and she thought, not today. Please God, not today. Then she heard Victor's boots on the stairs. Before you go any further, if you've ever loved a story about a woman who finds her way back to herself, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The Hargrove house sat at the north end of Hellgate, Montana, 3 miles from town, and 1,000 miles from anywhere Emily Carter had ever imagined her life would take her. It was a fine house by any measure. 2 stories of dressed timber and river stone, with a covered porch that wrapped the front and east sides and windows tall enough to let the summer light pour through in long yellow bars every morning. From the outside, people in town called it the finest home in the Bitterroot Valley. From the inside, Emily called it what it was, a cage with curtains. She was 24 years old. She had been Mrs. Victor Hargrove for 3 of those years, and in that time she had learned a set of skills she never asked to learn. She had learned how to cover a bruise with rice powder so it didn't show at Sunday services. She had learned which floorboards near the bedroom door creaked and which ones didn't. She had learned the exact sound of Victor's footstep when he was drinking versus when he was sober, and she had learned the hardest and most necessary lesson of all, that the difference between those 2 things mattered far less than people might think. Victor Hargrove was not a better man sober. He was simply a quieter one. His boots hit the top stair now, and Emily turned from the window and set her face into the expression she had also learned over 3 years. Not quite a smile, not quite blankness. Something in between that Victor had never once questioned, because Victor Hargrove did not pay close attention to his wife's face unless he was putting his hand to it. "Coffee," he said. He didn't say good morning. He hadn't said good morning to her since the first month of their marriage, back when he was still performing the role of husband for an audience he'd already stopped caring about. "It's on the stove," Emily said. He crossed the kitchen and poured himself a cup and stood at the table drinking it with his back to her, and Emily turned back to the window and let herself breathe. This was how mornings went when they went well. Victor drank his coffee. He read whatever correspondence had come up from town. He left before 8 to ride out to whatever parcel of land or business arrangement required his presence that day. And Emily spent the remaining hours doing the 1,000 invisible tasks that kept the house running, which Victor acknowledged the same way a man acknowledged the air he breathed by never thinking about it at all. She was reaching for the bread knife to cut the morning loaf when he spoke again. "Madeline's coming Friday." Emily's hand stopped. Madeline Hargrove was Victor's aunt, arrived originally from St. Louis 4 years ago with a trunk full of expensive dresses and a tongue sharpened to a degree that made ordinary cruelty look like kindness by comparison. She had taken one long assessing look at Emily on their first meeting and said with perfect social pleasantness, "Well, Victor always did have modest tastes." She visited 4 or 5 times a year. Every visit lasted at least 2 weeks. Emily had stopped counting the days somewhere in the 2nd year because counting made it worse. "I'll have the East Room ready," Emily said. "She's staying a month this time." Victor set his cup down. "There's a land arrangement she wants to observe. Some business with the Creighton parcel up near the North Ridge." "A month?" Emily repeated. She kept her voice level. "Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "No problem." Victor turned then and looked at her, and Emily met his eyes with that expression she had spent 3 years constructing, and after a moment he looked away again and picked up his hat from the hook by the door. He was 41 years old and still a broadly built man, thick through the shoulders, with a jaw that had gone heavy in the past few years, and eyes the color of old creek water, not quite gray, not quite green, and never once warm. People in Hellgate called him a success. They said he'd built something real out here in the Bitterroot Valley. They said he was firm but fair. Emily knew what firm meant. She knew it in 3 years of specifics that she kept locked behind that expression, like kindling behind a closed door. "Town today," Victor said, pulling his hat on. "I need the order picked up from Alderman's store. Take the wagon. Be back before noon." "Yes," Emily said. He left. The door closed behind him. Emily stood at the kitchen table and let 30 full seconds pass before she let herself unfold the hand she hadn't realized she'd been holding in a fist at her side. The ride into Hellgate took 40 minutes along a road that cut through meadow grass gone gold in the July heat. Emily drove the wagon herself. Victor's man Dolan usually drove her, but Dolan was out on the North Range today, and Victor had either forgotten this or decided it didn't matter. Emily was glad of it. 40 minutes alone on a road with nothing around her but grass and sky and the distant blue-gray rise of the Bitterroot Mountains to the west was the closest thing she had to peace. She let herself look at those mountains the way she always did on this road. They were something. Whatever else was wrong in the world, those mountains were something genuine. They rose up out of the valley floor in hard-edged ridgelines that caught the morning light on their upper faces, while the ravines and timber slopes below stayed dark and cool. And there was something about the scale of them, the way they simply were without apology, without explanation, that Emily found difficult to look away from. People in town talked sometimes about strange sightings up on the high ridges. A figure seen moving through timber at distances that made no sense for an ordinary man. Signs in the high meadows that suggested a camp no one could locate. Old Walt Penny at the feed store called it a ghost. The widow Aldrich called it nonsense. Jim Creighton, before Victor had pushed him off his land the previous spring, had said he'd seen the man once from 200 yards, big, dark-coated, moving through the tree line like he belonged to it rather than passing through it. Emily didn't know what she thought about that. She knew what she thought about the mountains themselves, though. She thought they looked like something that could not be owned. That was the thing about Victor. Everything around him eventually got sorted into what he owned and what he intended to own. Land-cattle trade agreements, the votes of men on the county board, the sheriff's willing cooperation, the silence of a town that understood the arithmetic of crossing a man who held the notes on half its property. And 3 years ago, one woman who had come to him not by choice, but by the blunt and specific pressure of her family's debt, which Victor had acquired and called in with perfect legal precision, and the satisfied patience of a man who had learned to mistake ownership for love. Emily turned the wagon onto Hellgate's Main Street and pulled up in front of Alderman's General. The store was cool and smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the particular dry goods smell of bolts of cloth and leather goods and tinned preserves stacked in their rows. Mr. Alderman himself was behind the counter, a compact man in his 60s with careful eyes, who had always been decent to Emily in the way people in Hellgate were decent to her correctly, at a measured distance, with the specific kindness of people who understood her situation and had decided long ago that understanding it was the furthest they were prepared to go. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "order's been waiting. Let me get it from the back." Emily nodded and moved along the front counter, looking at nothing in particular, doing the things she had also learned to do in public spaces, making herself small and unremarkable, a woman doing an errand. Nothing notable. Nothing that invited conversation, or comment, or the specific discomfort that came over people when they looked at Emily Carter Hargrove and felt the thing they preferred not to feel. The bell above the door rang. She didn't look up. "Emily." She looked up. Clara Dean stood in the doorway, 22 years old, with her husband Thomas just behind her. Clara had been Emily's closest friend before the marriage, had been in fact the maid of honor at the wedding, the last person to embrace Emily before Victor walked her to the Hargrove carriage. In 3 years, they had spoken perhaps 8 times. Clara's husband Thomas was a man who leased grazing rights from Victor, and there was nothing more to say about the geometry of that arrangement than those words contained. "Hello, Clara," Emily said. Clara glanced behind her at Thomas, who was examining a display of harness fittings with deep apparent interest. She stepped closer to Emily and dropped her voice. "Are you all right?" she said. It came out quick and careful, like something she'd been rehearsing. "I'm fine," Emily said. "I heard at the widow Aldrich's last week, people were saying, 'I'm fine, Clara,' Clara looked at her. Really looked at her the way almost no one did anymore. Emily felt it and held herself still under it. "I worry about you," Clara said. "Don't," Emily said. And then, because it was true, and because it was kinder than some alternatives, "There's nothing you can do." Clara's face did something complicated. Thomas turned from the harness display and said, "Clara, we should get what we came for." And Clara looked at him, and then back at Emily, and then nodded once very slightly, and moved away down the counter. Mr. Alderman came back with the order in a crate, and set it on the counter, and read Emily the total which she paid from the household money Victor gave her, for exactly this purpose, counted to the dollar, never a cent extra. She carried the crate to the wagon herself, because there was no one to help her, and because she had learned not to wait for help in the particular way a person learns that, through the gradual and specific death of expecting it. She was tying the crate down when she heard the voices. Two men she didn't know sitting on the bench outside the barber shop across the street, passing through by the look of them dusty trail clothes, horses tied at the post. One of them was watching her. "That Hargrove's wife," he said to the other, not troubling to lower his voice. "Yeah," the other said. The first one made a sound. "Hell of a waist." Emily finished tying the crate and climbed back up onto the wagon seat, and picked up the reins and looked straight down the street at nothing in particular. She did not cry. She had not cried and she couldn't remember exactly how long. Long enough that the impulse when it came felt like a warning about weakness rather than a natural thing. She turned the wagon and started back up the street. It was on the return road 3 miles north of town that she saw him for the first time. Or rather, that she was certain she saw him. She'd caught shapes in her peripheral vision before, up on the ridgeline, and told herself it was deer or a trick of summer light through the pines. She'd heard stories enough times that she'd begun to assume she was manufacturing sightings out of the stories the way a tired mind manufactures patterns. But this was not peripheral. This was direct. He was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 80 yards off the road, on a slight rise that put him above her sight line. Just standing. Not hiding. Not moving. A very tall man, in dark clothes with no hat, watching the road, with the same quality of attention the mountains themselves seemed to give to things, total patient, with no particular urgency. Emily pulled the wagon to a stop, without deciding to. They looked at each other across 80 yards of summer meadow. Then he turned and walked back into the timber, and within 4 steps, the tree line had absorbed him as completely as if he had never been there at all. Emily sat on the stopped wagon for a long moment. Then she shook the reins and drove home. Victor was already back when she pulled up to the house, which was not what she'd expected. His horse was tied at the post, and she could hear him moving inside before she reached the door, and something in the weight of those footsteps, heavier than the morning version, more deliberate, told her the day had not gone the way he'd intended. She came inside and set the crate on the kitchen table and began unpacking it. "You were gone long," Victor said. He was in the doorway to the front room. "The order wasn't ready," Emily said. "I had to wait." "Who'd you talk to?" "Mr. Alderman. Clara Dean stopped in." "What did Clara Dean want?" "Nothing, just passing through." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and stood at the table looking at the crate. "Jim Creighton," he said, "has hired himself a territorial lawyer out of Missoula. Did you know that?" "I didn't," Emily said. "Somebody told him he has grounds to contest the land arrangement." Victor's voice was the particular quiet it got when he was working toward something. "Somebody gave him the name of a lawyer." "I wouldn't know anything about that," Emily said. "No," Victor said. "I don't imagine you would." But he kept standing there, and Emily kept her hands steady on the items. She was unpacking a bag of flour and a tin of baking powder and a pound of coffee. And she didn't look at him because she had learned that looking at him in these moments was the same as confirming that she knew what was coming, and confirming it made it arrive faster. "The Creighton situation," Victor said, "is going to cause me significant inconvenience." "I'm sorry to hear it," Emily said. "Are you?" It wasn't a question. Emily set the coffee tin on the shelf. "I think," Victor said, "that you spend too much time in that store when I send you to town. Too much time around too many people." "I only spoke to—" She didn't finish the sentence because Victor's hand came across the side of her face fast and flat, the way it always did. Not a fist, never quite a fist, as if that distinction meant something. And the edge of the table caught her hip as she stumbled, and she got both hands on the counter and held herself upright and waited for the ringing in her ear to subside. From now on, Victor said, "You go to the store and you come straight home. No standing around. No conversations with women whose husbands have loose mouths." "Clara's husband doesn't—" "Emily." She stopped. "Yes," she said. "All right." Victor picked up his hat, which he'd set on the table when he came in, and put it back on. "Madeline's train gets to Missoula Thursday. I'll be gone overnight to collect her. I expect the house ready when we return." He walked out. The door didn't slam. Victor never slammed doors. He closed them with the precise, controlled click of a man who understood that restraint performed correctly was its own kind of threat. Emily stood at the counter with both hands flat against it and her ears still ringing, and counted the reasons, as she sometimes did, why she could not simply leave. No money of her own. Victor controlled every cent. No family to go to. Her father dead 2 years past. Her mother gone before that. A brother in Colorado who didn't write and didn't know and wouldn't know what to do with the knowing, even if she told him. No legal standing that meant anything in a county where the sheriff played cards with her husband twice a week, and the judge had been appointed through the mechanism of Victor's considerable influence with the territorial board. No one in Hellgate who would risk what they'd risk by helping her. She had thought about running. She had done the arithmetic of running over and over in the quiet of sleepless nights, and the long afternoons when Victor was away, and the house felt like it was made of compressed silence instead of timber and stone. She knew what the arithmetic came out to. She had known it for a long time. She pushed off the counter and began putting away the rest of the order. Choam. That night, lying awake in the dark, with Victor's heavy breathing on the other side of the bed, Emily thought about the man at the tree line. She didn't know why she kept returning to it. There was no particular reason for one stranger standing at the edge of some timber to stay with her the way this one did. She had seen strangers before. The Bitterroot Valley got its share of drifters in the summer months, men moving between the mining settlements and the river towns. But there had been something in the way he stood, something in the quality of his stillness that was different from ordinary stillness, not the stillness of a man resting or a man uncertain of direction, but the stillness of something that was simply and completely itself, requiring nothing and conceding nothing. Out here, no one owns anyone. She didn't know where the words came from. They arrived in her mind complete in a voice she didn't recognize, and she lay with them in the dark until sleep came. When she dreamed of the mountains. Not of being in them. Just of looking at them the way she'd looked at them from the road that morning, that unownable blue-gray rising. That thing that simply was. She woke at gray dawn with her hand against her cheek where it still ached, and she got up and dressed in the dark as she always did, and went down to start the fire for coffee, and through the kitchen window. The Bitterroot Range was just beginning to catch the first edge of morning light on its upper ridges. She stood at the window and looked at it for a long time. Then she heard Victor's boots on the stairs, and she turned from the mountains and set her face, and the morning began. Madeline Hargrove arrived on a Thursday afternoon with 3 trunks, a hat box, and the particular energy of a woman who had decided before she even stepped off the train exactly what she thought of everything she was about to encounter. Victor brought her in the good carriage. Emily heard them coming up the drive and was already at the door when they pulled up, hands folded in front of her posture, correct face arranged into that expression she'd spent 3 years perfecting. The one that said nothing. The one that cost her something every single time she put it on. Madeline stepped down from the carriage and looked at Emily, the way a buyer looks at a horse top to bottom, unhurried, assigning value. "You've lost weight," Madeline said. No greeting, no hello, just that. "Victor." "She's lost weight. She looks drawn." "She's fine." Victor said, handing the reins to Dolan. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking about her. Madeline climbed the porch steps and stopped in front of Emily. Up close, she smelled of powder, and the particular perfume she always wore, something floral and expensive that Emily had come to associate with the slow tightening of everything. Are you eating? Yes, ma'am, Emily said. You don't look it. Madeline moved past her into the house, already pulling off her gloves. The east room, I assume. I hope you aired it properly this time. Last visit it smelled of must for the first 3 days, and I didn't say anything because I was trying to be charitable. Emily followed her inside. I aired it Monday and again yesterday. Good. Have someone bring my trunks up. Not that Dolan he dropped my hat box the last time and I won't have it. I'll see to it myself, Emily said. Madeline stopped in the center of the front room and turned slowly, taking inventory of the space the way she always did on arrival, checking for whatever had changed or failed to change since her last visit. Her eyes moved across the furniture, the curtains, the arrangement of things on the mantel, and her expression during this survey was the expression of a woman who expected to find fault and was rarely disappointed. That vase, she said, pointing at the blue porcelain piece on the side table. It's in the wrong place. It was here last time, too. Things should have a correct position and stay in it. Emily moved the vase. Not there. There. Madeline pointed again. Emily moved it again. There. Yes. Madeline nodded once, satisfied. In the small and precise way, she was satisfied by small corrections. Now, supper at 6. And I'll want coffee brought up at 9 tonight. Not the dark roast Victor prefers, it keeps me awake. The lighter one. Of course, Emily said. Madeline finally looked at her directly. Something moved in the older woman's eyes, not warmth, but something adjacent to attention. You're angry, she said. Emily met her gaze. No, ma'am. Yes, you are. You hide it well, but I've been reading women my entire life, and I know angry when I see it behind polite. She tilted her head slightly. Victor tells me you've been difficult lately. Emily felt the word land on her like something physical. I haven't been difficult. He says you were short with him last week over some business with a neighbor situation. I wasn't aware of it, Emily said. Madeline studied her another moment. Well, she said finally, I suppose that's between the two of you. She turned toward the stairs. 6 o'clock, Emily, and make sure the rolls are warm this time. The first week of Madeline's visit moved the way those weeks always moved, in a rhythm so suffocatingly organized that Emily sometimes felt she was living inside a clock. Meals at exact times. The front room rearranged to Madeline's preference. Conversations at supper that were not conversations at all, but rather performances in which Madeline spoke and Victor agreed, and Emily was present as a kind of human furnishing expected to respond when addressed and to otherwise not require anything from the room. On the third day, Madeline asked Emily to accompany her to the widow Aldrich's afternoon social. Emily understood immediately that this was not an invitation. It was a deployment. The widow Aldrich held a gathering at her house on the second Thursday of every month for the respectable women of Hellgate, which in practice meant the wives of the men Victor considered worth knowing. Emily had attended exactly twice since her marriage and had found both occasions to be exercises in a very specific and refined kind of cruelty, the kind that wears good manners, the way a blade wears a scabbard present always only occasionally drawn. She sat in the widow Aldrich's parlor in her best day dress and watched Madeline work the room. That was the only word for it. Madeline Hargrove did not attend social functions. She worked them. She moved from woman to woman with the purposeful warmth of a woman who had decided exactly what she wanted from each conversation before she sat down to have it. And she left each one a little more certain of something: that Victor was a remarkable man, that his business interests served the valley's prosperity, that the Creighton land situation was a very unfortunate business involving a very misguided man who had been treated more than fairly. Emily sat next to Ruth Calloway, whose husband managed the feed store, and watched this happen. She's something, Ruth said quietly, nodding toward Madeline. She is. Emily agreed. How do you stand a month of it? Emily looked at her hands in her lap. You find a way. Ruth was quiet a moment, then also quietly. My husband says Creighton's lawyer is good. Says he found something in the original deed transfer that doesn't hold up. Emily kept her face still. I wouldn't know anything about that. No, Ruth said. Course not. She paused. Jim Creighton's a decent man. He worked that land 20 years. I know, Emily said. Madeline laughed at something across the room. A large, genuine laugh that she deployed strategically in social settings because it made her seem accessible, and because it was. Emily had noticed always calculated to fill a room and redirect attention to herself at exactly the moment when another woman was becoming interesting. Ruth leaned a fraction closer. There's talk about a stranger up near the North Ridge. Bill Tanner's boy says he saw a camp up in the high timber above the Creighton land. No horses, no fire ring, just a camp neat as you please, and then gone the next morning. Emily looked up then, and something in her expression must have shifted because Ruth noticed. You've seen him, Ruth said. Not quite a question. I saw someone, on the road. I don't know who it was. People say he watches the valley. Ruth glanced across the room to make sure Madeline wasn't looking their way. Walt Penny says he came into the trading post once 3 years back. Bought supplies paid in good coin, didn't give a name. Walt says he's never seen a man that quiet. Not unfriendly, just not there the way most men are there, if that makes sense. It made more sense to Emily than she was prepared to say out loud. Madeline's eyes found her across the room just then, and Emily felt the gaze land like a hand on her shoulder, and she straightened and nodded once, and watched Madeline turn smoothly back to her conversation. The twist that changed the shape of everything came not with noise, but with paper. On the 9th day of Madeline's visit, Emily was making the beds in the East Room when she knocked a book off the side table, and it fell open on the floor. A folded paper slid out from between the pages. She picked up the book first, set it on the table. Then she picked up the paper. She should have put it back unread. She knew she should have put it back unread. She also knew with the same certainty that she wasn't going to. It was a letter in Madeline's handwriting addressed to a man named Everett Collis in Missoula. The letter was dated 6 days before Madeline's arrival in Hellgate. Emily read it once quickly, and then read it again slowly, and by the second reading, her hands were not entirely steady. The letter concerned Jim Creighton's lawyer. The letter described in Madeline's crisp and precise handwriting a specific arrangement by which Everett Collis, who Emily did not know, but who was apparently a man with influence over the Territorial Land Office, would ensure that any appeal Creighton filed would be routed to a specific adjudicator named in the letter who would find against him. The letter referenced a sum of money, a significant sum described in a way that left no ambiguity about its purpose. Victor wasn't just fighting Creighton in the courts. He was purchasing the outcome before Creighton got there. Emily folded the letter carefully along its original crease and put it back inside the book exactly where it had been, and replaced the book on the side table and finished making the bed. She moved through the rest of the morning on the surface of herself, doing the things that needed doing, keeping her face exactly right. Inside, underneath that surface, something that had been very still for a very long time was not still anymore. She didn't know what to do with what she knew. That was the honest truth of it. The arithmetic hadn't changed. She had no money, no allies, no legal standing. Victor's reach in this county extended to every institution that might otherwise have mattered. Knowing about the letter changed nothing practical about her situation. But it changed something else. It put a word to something that had been shapeless for 3 years. Victor had always been a man who took things. Land authority cooperation, a woman's life reduced to a set of correct performances. Emily had understood this in the way you understand something that is simply the condition of your existence without needing to name it as wrong in any larger sense, because naming it brought no relief and only made the weight heavier. But there was Jim Creighton, who had worked his land for 20 years. And there was a letter with a sum of money written in it, and there was a specific named adjudicator who would decide against him before the evidence was even presented. That was not just the condition of Emily's existence. That was something that reached past her, past one woman in one house into the larger world where it was damaging something real. She thought about Ruth Calloway's voice in the parlor. Jim Creighton's a decent man. She thought about the man at the tree line standing the way the mountains stood. Cheat. That afternoon, Victor came home with two men Emily didn't recognize. Broad, deliberate men with the particular quality of hired muscle that had learned to dress well enough to stand in a decent room. He introduced them to no one and sent Emily to the kitchen, and Emily went. But the kitchen window looked onto the front room through a gap in the curtain where the fabric had never quite met, and Emily stood at the sink and listened. "The lawyer gets to Missoula Thursday," one of the men said. "He won't be in any condition to present anything by Friday," the other said. Emily's hands went still in the dishwater. "Nothing that connects back," Victor said. His voice was its usual controlled quiet. The voice of a man discussing logistics. "I want it to look like a road accident. Men traveling alone take risks. It's unfortunate, but it happens. Consider it done." Emily stood at the sink for a long moment after they left the room. The water had gone cold around her hands, and she hadn't noticed. Jim Creighton's lawyer was going to be killed on a road outside Missoula, and Victor was going to buy the land office outcome, and Jim Creighton was going to lose 20 years of work, and the law in this county was going to stand by and let every piece of it happen. She knew all of this now. Knowing it and doing nothing with it were two different things, and she had no illusions about which one she was capable of. Except that the man in the timber above the Creighton land had set up a camp. And someone who camps above a man's property in high timber, watching a valley, that is a person with a specific interest in what happens in that valley. And somewhere between that fact and the letter in Madeline's book and the two men who had just walked out of her husband's front room, Emily Carter began very quietly to think. She went to town 3 days later on the supply errand without Dolan because Dolan's horse had thrown a shoe, and Victor had forgotten he'd restricted her movements, or had chosen to forget, because he was occupied with Madeline's land office correspondence and the logistics of something he clearly considered nearly settled. She drove the wagon to Alderman's General and picked up the order and said nothing to anyone. Then she drove 1 block north and stopped in front of Walt Penny's trading post, which was not part of the errand, and which she had never stopped at alone before, and she sat on the wagon for a moment and breathed. Then she climbed down and went inside. Walt Penny was behind his counter, a large, slow-moving man in his 70s, who had been trading in this valley since before Hellgate had a name, and who regarded most of the human drama that passed through his establishment with the equanimity of a man who had seen enough of it to stop being surprised. He looked at Emily and said nothing. He waited. "I need to get a message to someone," Emily said. She kept her voice low and steady. "Someone up in the high timber above the Creighton land." Walt looked at her for a long moment. "That's so. I know you've seen him. You traded with him once, 3 years ago." Another pause. "I trade with a lot of people." "Walt." She looked at him directly. "Please." He studied her face. She let him look. She didn't arrange her expression into anything. She just let him see what was there, which was most of what she'd been keeping behind that other expression for 3 years. And after a moment, Walt Penny picked up a pencil from his counter and set a small piece of paper down in front of her. "I can't promise anything reaches anybody," he said. "Man like that comes and goes as he sees fit. If he happens to come through and happens to ask after things in the valley, I might happen to pass something along. That's the most I can tell you." "That's enough," Emily said. She wrote 7 words on the paper. "They're going to kill Creighton's lawyer Thursday." She folded it and left it on the counter and walked out. On the drive home halfway between town and the house, she glanced at the tree line the way she always did on this road. Nothing there. The timber stood closed and still in the summer heat the way timber does, keeping its own counsel. She turned her eyes back to the road. But for the first time in 3 years, the first time in longer than that, if she was being fully honest, the arithmetic felt different. Not easier. Nothing about her situation was easier. Victor would come home tonight, and Madeline would be at supper, and the house would be what the house always was, and Emily's choices were still what they had always been. But there was a piece of paper in Walt Penny's trading post with 7 words on it. And whether those words reached anyone or not, they were the first thing in 3 years that Emily Carter had done purely because she decided to. Not because she had to. Not because it was safe. Because she decided. She pulled the wagon into the drive and climbed down and began untying the supply crate, and through the kitchen window she could see Madeline sitting at the table with her correspondence, and from inside she could hear Victor's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and the house was exactly what it always was. Emily lifted the crate and carried it to the door. Her hands were completely steady. 3 days passed and nothing happened. Emily went about the house the way she always went about the house, making meals, managing Madeline's requirements, keeping her face exactly right, and the message sat in Walt Penny's trading post, and either someone found it or no one did. And either way, the world continued to turn at exactly the same indifferent pace it always had. On the second day, she almost convinced herself she'd been foolish. A piece of paper with 7 words on it, left with an old man who'd made her no promises. Addressed to a person who may or may not exist in any practical sense, who may have been nothing more than a story the valley told itself, because valleys need stories the way people need air. On the third day, she stopped almost convincing herself and just lived, with not knowing which was harder and more honest. Thursday arrived. Victor left before sunup, which was not unusual, but he left with Dolan and the 2 broad-shouldered men from the parlor meeting, and he didn't tell Emily where he was going, which was also not unusual, but something about the particular quality of his silence at breakfast, focused, satisfied the silence of a man who expects his day to go the way he planned it, told her that whatever was going to happen to Jim Creighton's lawyer was scheduled to happen today. She washed the breakfast dishes and said nothing. Madeline came down at 8, poured herself coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with a letter she was composing to someone in Missoula. And Emily moved around her, the way she'd learned to move around all of Victor's furniture, animate and otherwise, making herself take up as little space as possible. "You're quiet this morning," Madeline said without looking up from her letter. "I'm always quiet," Emily said. "You're a different kind of quiet today." Madeline set her pen down and looked at Emily with those assessing eyes. "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing, ma'am." "Emily?" The older woman's voice had an edge that was almost in its way respectful. "I've been watching women my entire life. The ones who say they're thinking about nothing are always thinking about something specific." Emily set the last dish on the shelf and turned and looked at Madeline directly. "I was thinking about Jim Creighton," she said. She didn't plan to say it. It arrived out of the same place the 7 words on the paper had arrived from, the place that had been quiet for 3 years and was not quiet anymore. Madeline's expression didn't change. "That's not your concern. He worked that land for 20 years, and he borrowed against it and couldn't meet his obligations. That's a transaction, Emily, not a tragedy." "He didn't borrow from Victor. Victor bought his debt from the bank in Missoula after the drought year when Jim couldn't make the payment. Jim didn't even know until the letter came." Madeline picked up her pen. "You know a great deal about Victor's business for a woman who claims to know nothing." "I listen," Emily said. "People underestimate how much a quiet woman hears." The 2 women looked at each other across the kitchen. Something passed between them that had never passed between them before. Not warmth. Nothing like warmth, but a kind of mutual recognition. 2 women who understood the arithmetic of the room they were in, and what it cost, and what it was worth. Then Madeline looked back at her letter. "Be careful, Emily," she said, and it came out neither as threat nor as advice, but as something in between, which was, Emily thought, the most honest thing Madeline Hargrove had ever said to her. The thing Emily hadn't anticipated was how the waiting would feel when it shifted. She'd been waiting for 3 years in the broad and general sense, waiting for a situation to change that she had no mechanism to change. This was different. This was waiting for a specific thing, a thing she'd put in motion with 7 words on a piece of paper. And the difference between those 2 kinds of waiting was the difference between drowning slowly and treading water. Both exhausting, only one of them active. She was taking the noon laundry off the line when she heard the horse. Not the rhythm of a known horse coming up the drive, The cadence of that, she could read the way you read weather, having catalogued it over years. This was different. One horse moving fast, coming from the north road rather than the town road, pulling up hard at the gate. She came around the side of the house with an armful of dry laundry and saw a boy she recognized, Danny Creighton, Jim's youngest, maybe 14, on a horse that had been run hard. He saw her and swung down before the horse fully stopped. "Mrs. Hargrove." He was breathing like he'd run part of the way himself. "Is your husband here?" "No," Emily said. "What happened?" Danny looked at her. He had his father's eyes, the same direct, uncomplicated quality that had no practice in concealment. Two men stopped Mr. Aldred on the Missoula Road. His horse came back without him. He swallowed. But Mr. Aldred wasn't on the road. He wasn't where they stopped. Emily went very still. "Someone warned him," Danny said. "He took the Ridge Road instead. He's already in Missoula. He filed the appeal this morning, first thing." The boy's voice cracked on the next part. "My father sent me to tell Mr. Hargrove because he said Mr. Hargrove should know that the land office received the filing at 9 o'clock and it's already assigned to the Territorial Review Board, and there's nothing." He stopped. "My father said to say there's nothing to be done about it now." Emily stood holding the laundry in both arms and looked at this boy who was delivering his father's message with the careful precision of someone who understood the danger of what he was carrying and had chosen to carry it anyway. "I'll tell him," she said. "You go home to your father." Danny hesitated. "Are you going to be all right, ma'am, when you tell him?" Emily looked at the boy for a moment. 14 years old, asking that question. She thought about what it meant that a 14-year-old boy thought to ask it. "Yes," she said. "Go home, Danny." He went. Emily stood in the yard with the laundry and the summer heat and the fact of what she'd just been told, and somewhere between one breath and the next, the shape of the next several hours arranged itself in her mind with the cold clarity of inevitability. Victor was going to come home. Victor was going to find out that his men had stopped a man who wasn't there. Victor was going to understand that someone had warned Aldred, and he was going to work backward through that chain with the systematic patience of a man who had learned that power is mostly the willingness to follow a thing to its end. Walt Penny would not give her up. She believed that, with a certainty, she couldn't entirely justify, except that Walt Penny had the eyes of a man who had made that kind of decision a long time ago and would not unmake it. But Victor would find another route. He always found another route. She went inside and put the laundry away and started supper and said nothing to Madeline, who watched her from the front room with those careful eyes and also said nothing. And the house ticked along in its ordinary rhythm, while outside the afternoon light moved across the Bitterroot Range and the day began its slow lean toward evening. Victor came home at 7. Emily heard it in the way he came through the door, the particular force of a man containing something large. Not loud. Never loud in the way that announced itself. The force of a dam holding, which is a different and more dangerous kind of force entirely. He came into the kitchen where Emily was at the stove and stood without speaking for a moment. "Supper's nearly ready," Emily said. "Danny Creighton came here today," Victor said. Not a question. He'd passed someone on the road, or Dolan had seen the boy's horse at the gate. Some piece of information had already reached him. "Yes," Emily said. "He brought a message from his father." And she turned from the stove and looked at him. This was the moment. Every conversation with Victor had a moment like this, a pivot where the thing said next determined the geography of everything that followed. She had learned to navigate those pivots with enormous care, choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground. "He said the lawyer filed the appeal this morning," Emily said. "He said the land office received it and assigned it to the Territorial Review Board." The silence that followed had weight. "Aldred took the Ridge Road," Victor said. So Danny said. "Someone told him." Victor's voice was entirely controlled. "Someone told him not to take the Missoula Road." Danny didn't say who. Victor looked at her. She met his eyes with her expression, that surface, that necessary surface, and something moved in his face that she recognized as calculation. He was deciding what he knew and what he could prove, and what the difference between those two things meant for what happened next. "Madeline," he called. Madeline appeared in the doorway. She looked between Victor and Emily with her usual comprehensive assessment. "Did Emily go to town this week?" Victor asked. "Tuesday," Madeline said. "Supply errand. She was back before noon." "Did she stop anywhere besides Alderman's?" A pause. Emily kept her eyes on Victor's face. "Not that I'm aware of," Madeline said. It was not a lie technically. Madeline hadn't been with her. Madeline wasn't aware. Emily filed the distinction away in the part of her mind that was always underneath everything watching and recording. Victor looked at Emily another long moment. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down at the table. "Serve supper," he said. Emily served supper. She was wrong about the storm holding until morning. It came at 10 o'clock after Madeline had gone upstairs, and the house had settled into its nighttime sounds. Victor had been in the front room with a glass of whiskey and his correspondence, and Emily had been in the kitchen doing the last of the dishes, and she had almost believed in the foolish and involuntary way you believe things you know better than to believe that the evening was going to end without incident. Then Victor appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Who did you talk to," he said, "when you went to town Tuesday?" "Mr. Alderman." Ruth Calloway stopped in briefly. Ruth Calloway. He turned the name over. And that was all. He crossed the kitchen. Emily put the last dish down on the shelf and turned to face him because facing what was coming had always been better than being caught turned away from it, and she met his eyes and held them. "You left a message for someone," he said. "I don't know how yet, but you did." "I don't know what you mean," Emily said. The first blow caught her across the cheek with enough force to knock her back into the counter. She caught the counter's edge with both hands and held herself upright. She had learned over 3 years to hold herself upright, and the ringing started in her left ear, and she breathed through it. "Who?" Victor said. "I didn't." The second one came faster. She went down this time, one knee hitting the kitchen floor, and she put her hand up against the cabinet and stayed there breathing, and the floor was solid under her knee, and she focused on that, the specific physical solidity of the floor, the way she had taught herself to focus on it. "You think Creighton winning this means something," Victor said. He was not yelling. He never yelled. "You think some territorial review board is going to find in his favor, and that changes something. It doesn't. I will buy that board the same way I bought the last one. The only thing that changes is that I now know my own wife is working against me inside my own house." Emily pushed herself up from the floor and stood. Victor looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Not regret, never regret, but a recalibration. He had expected her to stay down. "Go to bed," he said. She went. She climbed the stairs in the dark and lay down on the bed with her cheek against the pillow and the left side of her face pulsing with a pain that she breathed through and cataloged the way she cataloged everything. How bad? How long it would last? How visible by morning? Very bad. Several days. Visible enough to matter and not enough to give anyone who didn't already know a reason to act. She lay in the dark and thought about Aldred filing his appeal at 9 o'clock in the morning, first thing before anyone could stop it. She thought about that filing existing now in the territorial record in Missoula, assigned to the review board, immovable. She had done that. With 7 words on a piece of paper and Walt Penny's willingness to pass them along, she had done that one specific thing. Victor could buy the next outcome. He probably would. Jim Creighton might still lose his land. The arithmetic of this valley was still what it was. But the appeal existed. Someone had stood up between Victor Hargrove and the thing he intended and said no, not today, and that someone had, in some chain of consequence that Emily couldn't fully see, been set in motion by her. By a woman who was not supposed to be capable of setting anything in motion at all. She pressed her face carefully into the pillow. Outside the bedroom window, the night was clear and enormous, the way summer nights in the Bitterroot got when the heat of the day finally released. Stars thick as thrown grain from one edge of the sky to the other. She thought about the man in the timber. She thought about whoever it was that had somehow gotten word to Aldred in time for him to take the Ridge Road. She thought about Walt Penny's pencil set down on the counter, with the deliberate patience of a man deciding something. Sleep came slowly and fitfully, and she let it. She was at the kitchen table the next morning, hands around a coffee cup, when the knock came at the back door. Not the front door. The back. That was the first thing. She set her cup down and opened it. A boy she didn't recognize, young maybe 16, with the look of someone who lived outdoors, stood on the step. He held out a folded piece of paper without speaking. Emily took it. She opened it. 3 words in handwriting she didn't know spare, and even the handwriting of someone who chose each letter with the same economy they brought to everything else. Alderman's. Noon today. She looked up. The boy was already gone. She stood at the back door for a moment with the paper in her hand. Then she folded it twice and put it in her apron pocket and went to the stove and started the breakfast fire. And when Madeline came down 20 minutes later, Emily was making biscuits with her back to the room and her face composed. "You're bruised," Madeline said. "I walked into the cabinet in the dark," Emily said. A silence. Then the sound of Madeline pouring her coffee. "Of course," Madeline said. Emily's hands kept working the dough. The note in her apron pocket felt like a coal held close, warm, specific, requiring careful handling. Alderman's. Noon today. She would need a reason to go to town. She would need to go alone. She would need to manage both of those things without making them visible, without Victor or Dolan or Madeline tracking the departure and the destination. She would need to do all of this with the left side of her face showing what it showed, which would make her conspicuous in a town where people had learned not to look at her too closely. She pressed the biscuits out one by one and put them in the pan. It was 8 in the morning. She had 4 hours. At 9:30 she went to Victor in his study with the household account book and told him the flour supply was short, they'd used more than expected with Madeline's visit, and she needed to make a trip to Alderman's. Victor looked at her across his desk, looked at her face. His expression registered the bruising with no visible reaction, the way a man registers a thing he has made and does not feel the need to account for. "Dolan can go," he said. "Dolan's fixing the fence line on the east side. You asked him to finish it before Sunday." This was true. She had been listening for things she could use, and she had used this one. "I'll only be an hour." Victor looked at her another moment. The calculation again, what she knew, what she could do with it, whether the answer to the second question was still nothing. He was still, she could see, working out the chain between her and Aldred's warning. He didn't have it yet. "An hour," he said. "Back by 11. "Yes," Emily said. She went to town. Alderman's General was half empty at noon, which was normal for a Friday, most of the valley's men being on their land at that hour. Emily came in and went to the counter and told Mr. Alderman she needed flour, which was true, and he went to the back to measure it out. She waited at the counter. The door opened. The man who came in was not what she expected. She had built some version of him in her mind from fragments Walt Penny's description. Danny's father's camp in the high timber, the figure at the tree line, the 3 words in that spare handwriting, and what she had built was more idea than person. Something like the mountains. Something defined by its size and its silence. Cole Maddox was both of those things and also simply a man, tall enough that he had to navigate the doorframe with intention. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for years and carried the evidence. Not young, not old. The age that the mountains seemed to prefer in the people who took them seriously. He wore no gun visible, which meant nothing except that he was careful. He moved like a man who spent no energy on movement that wasn't necessary. He stopped at the counter 2 feet from Emily and did not look at her. He picked up a tin of something from the display and turned it in his hands. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. His voice was low and level-pitched for her and no one else. "You got my note," Emily said. "Walt got your note. I got it from Walt." He set the tin down. "Your lawyer made his filing." "I know," Victor's going to work out how the warning got to Aldred. It won't take him as long as you might hope. He turned the tin once more, still not looking at her directly the way two people who cannot be seen talking arrange not to be seen talking. When he does, it gets worse for you. It's already bad, Emily said. I know. A pause. I've been watching this valley for 6 months. I know what the bad looks like. Something about the matter-of-fact quality of that statement, the absence of pity in it, the simple acknowledgement steadied her in a way that sympathy would not have. Why? She asked. He was quiet a moment. Creighton's land borders a federal grazing corridor. If Victor fences it, he controls water access for 3 other families. It's not just one man's 20 years. It's the whole north end of the valley. He picked up the tin again. I don't like men who fence water. That's why you're here. Water rights. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time. His eyes were the same quality as his stillness, not warm, not cold, just entirely present. I'm here, he said, because some things need to be stood in front of. Mr. Alderman came back from the storeroom with the flour. Emily paid for it. Cole Maddox purchased the tin and 2 others and walked out without looking at her again, and Emily picked up her flour and thanked Mr. Alderman and left. She was 3 steps onto the boardwalk when she heard Victor's voice. He was across the street coming out of the sheriff's office with the sheriff and Dolan beside him. He wasn't supposed to be in town. He was supposed to be at the house working through his morning correspondence. He saw her. His eyes went immediately past her to Alderman's door, which was just swinging shut behind a tall man in dark clothes, who was already moving along the boardwalk north, not hurrying, not looking back. Victor's face did something very small and very specific, and Emily, who had studied that face for 3 years, read it completely. He had just found his chain. Emily, he said. He crossed the street. The sheriff followed. I thought you'd be back by 11. I'm on my way now, she said. His eyes moved once more to the retreating figure down the boardwalk and then back to her face, and the calculation in them was no longer working. It had finished working. It had arrived somewhere. Who is that? He said. I don't know, Emily said. Someone buying supplies. You were talking to him. I was standing at the counter. Mr. Alderman was in the back. Victor looked at her. The sheriff looked at her. Dolan looked at his boots. Go home, Victor said. She went. But she had seen Cole Maddox's face in the moment he looked at her directly, and she had seen the way his eyes moved to Victor when Victor crossed the street, and what she had seen in those eyes was not alarm, and not fear, and not the particular uncertainty of a man recalculating his risk. What she had seen was recognition. The quiet, complete recognition of a man who has located the thing he came to find. She drove the wagon home and unhitched the horse and put the flour on the shelf and started the midday meal. And when Victor came through the door 90 minutes later with his jaw set and his eyes carrying that focused, satisfied, closed-case look, she knew the next part of her life had just begun. Victor didn't hit her that night. That was the thing that frightened her more than if he had. He came home from town and ate supper with the controlled quiet of a man who had decided something and was taking his time about it, and he spoke to Madeline about the land office, and spoke to Emily about nothing, and after supper, he went to his study and closed the door, and Emily cleaned the kitchen and listened to the silence from behind that closed door, and understood it the way you understand a held breath by what it was waiting to release. Madeline passed through the kitchen at 9 with her nightly coffee cup and stopped. You should sleep tonight, she said. Actually sleep. I'm fine, Emily said. You keep saying that. Madeline looked at her with those eyes that missed nothing, and chose carefully what to do with what they found. He's made inquiries about the man in town today. Emily's hands went still on the dishcloth. The sheriff knows who he is, Madeline said. Or knows enough. Victor will have the rest by morning. Emily turned and looked at her. Why are you telling me this? Madeline was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost its usual precise social finish, and what was underneath was something older and more tired. Because I was 26 years old once, she said, in a house that was not mine, belonging to a man who had decided what I was, and no one told me anything. She picked up her coffee cup. Sleep tonight, Emily. Whatever you're thinking about doing, do it while you still have the choice. She went upstairs. Emily stood at the sink for a long time after her footsteps faded. She didn't sleep. She lay in the dark and listened to Victor's breathing and ran the arithmetic one more time, knowing it came out the same as it always had, except that now there were two things that hadn't been in the equation before. One was Cole Maddox, who was somewhere in the high timber above the valley, with the sheriff's knowledge of his identity making its way to Victor with the patience of morning. The other was Madeline's voice saying, "Do it while you still have the choice," which was the closest thing to an open door that anyone had put in front of Emily Carter in 3 years. She thought about what Victor would do when he had Cole Maddox's name and history fully in hand. The two men from the parlor meeting were still somewhere accessible. The sheriff's cooperation was guaranteed. Cole was one man in the mountains with no legal standing in this county, and no one in Hellgate who would stand up publicly to say otherwise. She thought about Cole's eyes in Alderman's store, the recognition in them when Victor crossed the street, the complete absence of fear. She thought about the fact that fear and wisdom were not the same thing, and that an absence of fear in a man who understood the situation he was in was either the most reassuring or the most alarming thing possible, and she couldn't decide which. At 4 in the morning, she got up. She dressed in the dark with the practice of someone who had done it hundreds of times and moved to the door and opened it on the side that didn't creak. She had mapped every creak in this house, the way a prisoner maps the gaps in a fence, and went down the hall. She took nothing from the bedroom, nothing that Victor could notice missing before morning. In the kitchen, she took the household money from the tin behind the flour canister. Not all of it enough. Her hand found it in the dark, and she counted it by feel and put it in her pocket. She took the kitchen knife, the small one, and put that in the other pocket. She found her coat on the hook by the back door and put it on. Then she stood at the back door with her hand on the latch and let herself acknowledge what she was doing. She was leaving. She was leaving with no plan past the timberline and no certainty that Cole Maddox was where she thought he was, and no guarantee that any of this led anywhere except to a different and possibly worse version of the situation she was already in. She was leaving anyway. She opened the back door and went out into the dark. The summer night was warm and dense with cricket sound and the smell of dry grass, and Emily moved across the yard and through the back gate and into the open ground north of the house, heading for the tree line. The Bitterroot Range was a black mass against a sky just barely beginning to differentiate itself from pure dark, and she walked toward it with the steady pace of a woman who had decided not to run, because running was how you fell. She was 200 yards from the house when she heard the back door. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She lengthened her stride and kept her eyes on the tree line and listened, and what she heard was one set of footsteps. Not Victor. The weight was wrong crossing the yard behind her. "Mrs. Hargrove," Dolan's voice. Not Victor. Dolan, who slept in the small room off the kitchen and who apparently slept lighter than she'd accounted for. She stopped. She turned. Dolan was 20 yards back, standing in the dark with his hat in his hands. He was a man in his 40s who had worked for Victor for 11 years and who had driven Emily to town and back more times than she could count, and who had in all that time never once spoken to her about anything except the weather and the state of the road. He stood there in the dark, holding his hat. "My horse is in the south paddock," he said. "The gray. She's saddled already." He paused. "I had a feeling about tonight." Emily looked at him. Victor sleeps hard after whiskey." He turned his hat once in his hands. "South paddock gate doesn't latch right. Always swinging open. I keep meaning to fix it." He put his hat back on. "Good night, Mrs. Hargrove." He went back inside. Emily stood in the dark for a moment. Then she went to the south paddock. The gray mare was exactly where Dolan said, saddled and calm. And Emily had ridden enough in her life before this one to manage a horse in the dark without trouble. She took the mare out of the paddock through the gate that didn't latch right and turned north and rode. She had no exact destination beyond the timber and the general direction of the Creighton land, which was the last place she knew Cole Maddox had been working. She rode in the dark and let the mare pick her footing on the slope as the ground began to rise, and the tree line received them both. And the dark under the pines was different from the dark of the open ground, denser with its own sounds, the creak and settle of timber, and the occasional movement of something in the brush that the mare noted with her ears but didn't spook from. Emily rode for 40 minutes before she pulled the mare up. She had the feeling sudden and specific of being watched. Not the anxious hunted feeling of being followed. Something else. The feeling of coming into a space where attention already existed. "I'm not going to hurt your horse," said a voice from her left out of the dark between two pines. "But she's about to step wrong on that slope. Give her left rein." Emily gave left rein. The mare shifted and found better ground under her feet. Cole Maddox came out of the trees on foot and stood at the mare's shoulder and looked up at Emily. In the dark, his face was mostly shadow, but his eyes caught what little light there was. "You left," he said. "Yes," Emily said. "He'll know by sunup." "I know." "Did he hurt you tonight?" The directness of the question, no softening, no social navigation around it. Just the question itself, delivered with the same plainness as everything else about him, hit her somewhere she hadn't expected. "Not tonight," she said. "Tonight he was quiet." That was almost worse. Cole nodded once, as if this confirmed something he already understood. "The sheriff has my name. Victor will have my history by morning, and he'll move fast after that. He doesn't have men who can track well in this timber, but he'll put enough of them up here to make up for it." "So what do we do?" Emily said. He looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" No one had asked her that question in 3 years. The simplicity of it arriving in the dark on a mountainside nearly undid her. She breathed through it. "I want Jim Creighton to keep his land," she said. "I want whatever Victor is paying to the Territorial Land Office to be on record somewhere that matters. I want—" She stopped. "I want it to mean something. Not just for me, for all of it." Cole was quiet for a moment. "Aldred is in Missoula with a filed appeal and a territorial lawyer. He has the case. What he doesn't have is what you know." "The letter," Emily said. "The letter." His voice didn't change. Madeline Hargrove's letter to Everett Collis in Missoula, naming an adjudicator and a sum of money. That letter in front of the Territorial Review Board ends this differently than it ends without it. Emily thought about the book on the side table in the East Room. The letter folded between pages. Madeline composing it at the kitchen table, 6 days before her arrival, in the small, precise handwriting of a woman who had been managing difficult situations for 50 years. "I didn't take it," Emily said. "No," Cole said. "But you know it exists. You know what it says. And a sworn affidavit from Victor Hargrove's wife with sufficient detail to be credible is something a Territorial Review Board cannot ignore the way it can ignore one farmer's appeal." He paused. "If you're willing to swear to what you know." "Victor will say I'm lying. He'll say I'm a disgruntled wife inventing—" "He will," Cole agreed. "And the review board will look at his record in this valley and at the pattern of how he's acquired land and at the specific details of your affidavit, and they will decide what they decide." He looked at her directly. "I won't tell you it's certain. Nothing in this is certain. But you asked what we do. That's what we do." The mare shifted under Emily, and she steadied her with one hand. "Missoula," Emily said. "There's a way through the high timber that puts us on the Missoula Road before daylight without coming near the main valley routes. It's hard going, but it's manageable." He looked at the mare. "She can handle it." "So can I," Emily said. Something moved in his expression. Not a smile exactly. An acknowledgement. "I know," he said. They rode through the high timber in the dark, and Cole moved ahead of her on foot, for the first hour leading the mare through the sections that required it. And Emily rode when she could and dismounted when he indicated and trusted his navigation with the completeness of someone who had run out of alternatives, and found to her surprise that trusting this particular person required no effort at all. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was specific: watch this route, give her head on this grade. Stop here and listen. Once on a level section where the trees thinned enough to let starlight through, he said out of nowhere, "You were the one who sent the message. Walt told me. A woman with a bruised face and 7 words that saved a man's life." Emily looked at the back of his head in the dark. "You were already watching." "I was watching," he said. "You acted." She thought about that for a while. The distinction felt important in a way she didn't have language for yet. Dawn came in gradually, the dark thinning to gray through the pine canopy, and with it came the sounds of morning birds and the specific quality of early light that made the world look both more real and more fragile than it did in full day. They stopped at a small creek to water the mare, and Emily climbed down and stood on solid ground and felt the long ride in her legs and said nothing about it. Cole crouched at the creek and cupped water in his hand and drank. "How long have you been up here?" Emily asked. "In this valley?" 6 months, he said. "Like I told you." "Before that?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet, not evasive, not uncomfortable, just taking the question seriously before answering it. "Montana Territory. Wyoming before that. I don't stay in one place long as a general rule." "Why this one?" He looked up at her from where he crouched. "Creighton had a letter in his pocket when I came through his property last fall. Federal water corridor map filed by a land office surveyor 3 years ago showing the easement through his north ridge. He didn't know what it meant legally. I did." He stood. "Man shouldn't lose what's his because he doesn't know which piece of paper to wave." "That's all," Emily said. He picked up the mare's lead. "That's enough," he said. And then after a moment, "You remind me of someone." She waited. "My mother," he said. "She was a ranch woman in Wyoming, quiet same way you're quiet. The kind of quiet that's not absence, it's everything being held together by one person and nobody noticing because she makes it look like nothing." Emily said nothing for a moment. Then, "What happened to her?" "Outlived my father by 20 years and died at 81 in her own house on her own land, which she'd legally transferred to her name the week after he died." He handed her the mare's reins. "Mount up. We've got 4 more miles." She mounted up. Yeah, the twist arrived with the sound of horses. They were an hour from the Missoula Road, moving through a stretch of timber where the going had opened up when Cole stopped walking and put his hand back, and Emily pulled the mare up and sat still. 3 horses. Below them, and moving fast on a route that was going to intersect their own within 15 minutes if nothing changed. "He moved faster than morning," Cole said. "He would have checked my room at first light," Emily said. "He knows I didn't take the main road." "He knows this timber," Cole said. "Or his men do." "Dolan does," Emily said, and then stopped. Dolan, who had saddled the mare and opened the gate and come out into the dark in his bare feet to tell her. Dolan, who had 11 years of Victor's roots and property knowledge in his head. Victor will have asked Dolan which way. Would Dolan tell him? Emily thought about Dolan standing in the dark with his hat in his hands. "He'd have to," she said. "He can't refuse Victor directly, but he might—" She stopped. "He'd tell him what he knew, but he'd leave out what he could. Question is what he could leave out." Cole moved off the trail into the tree line, and Emily urged the mare after him. He stopped and listened, and the hoofbeats below shifted closer, and then, inexplicably, veering south. Away from them. Emily let out a breath. "Dolan left something out," Cole said. "Yes," Emily said. "He did." They moved. The Missoula Road came up before them just after 7 in the morning, and Cole stopped at the tree line and looked both ways along it before he stepped out, and Emily followed on the mare, and they put the timber behind them and the road opened ahead. "There's a relay station 4 miles east," Cole said. "We can get a fresh horse there, and you can take the road the rest of the way. Faster without the timber." "And you?" Emily said, I'll follow the ridgeline parallel. Come in from the north side of Missoula before noon. They'll be watching the road. They'll be watching for one woman on a gray mare, he said. That's what I'd watch for if I were Victor. Which means a man on a different horse coming in separately is less interesting. He looked up at her. You know where the Territorial Land Office is? I've never been to Missoula, Emily said. Main Street North End brick building. Ask anyone. He reached up and put his hand briefly on the mare's neck. You'll be all right on the road. I know, Emily said. He looked at her. The full direct look she'd gotten twice now in Alderman's store, and then in the dark on the mountainside, and that she had found both times to be one of the steadiest experiences she could remember. A man who looked at you and saw what was actually there. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. Emily, she said. Something moved in his face. Emily. He said it once, simply as if fixing it. You did all of this. The message to Walt, the letter you found leaving last night. All of it was you. You were already here, she said. I was watching, he said. There's a difference. He turned and walked back into the tree line, and the timber closed around him, and Emily was alone on the Missoula Road with a gray mare and 4 miles to the relay station, and whatever came after that. She turned the mare east and rode. The relay station was run by a man named Horace, with a forgettable face and the precise transactional manner of someone who had spent his life exchanging things for money without particular curiosity about the things or the people carrying them. He looked at Emily's face, the bruising fully visible in daylight, yellowish at the edges now and deep at the center, and said nothing about it. He gave her a fresh horse, a bay with a smooth gait, and took the gray, and gave Emily $1 back from what she paid and said, Road's clear east. Stage came through 2 hours ago. She thanked him and rode. The Missoula Road in summer was warm and open, and entirely unlike anything Emily had moved through in 3 years. Which was to say, it was simply a road without walls on either side of it, and she was simply a woman on it without anyone knowing where she was. And the physical fact of that, the bare, uncomplicated fact of unobserved motion, felt like something she had forgotten the taste of so long ago. She'd stopped knowing she was hungry for it. She was 4 miles outside Missoula when the rider came up behind her. She heard the horse and turned, and her heart moved hard in her chest before she got a look at the rider, because for one moment she was certain it was Victor, or one of his men, and the road that had felt like freedom was going to become a trap. It was Jim Creighton. He pulled up alongside her on a sorrel horse, breathing hard, like he'd been moving fast since early morning, and his face had the look of a man who had made several decisions quickly, and was living with all of them at once. Mrs. Hargrove, he said. I heard you left the house last night. Danny saw horses on the North Ridge before sunup, and I put it together. He looked at her face, and something moved in his jaw. I'm going to Missoula, to talk to Aldred in person. I thought... He stopped. I thought maybe we were going the same direction. Emily looked at him. Jim Creighton was 53 years old, with 20 years of specific labor in his hands and face, and he was on a hard-ridden horse on the road to Missoula, because he had decided whatever the cost to be present for the thing that was going to determine the rest of his life. We are, she said. Ride with me. They rode together into Missoula, and Emily thought about how in the arithmetic of yesterday she had been one woman with no money and no allies and no legal standing, and in the arithmetic of this morning she had $11 and a sworn story, and a man who worked 20 years riding at her left, and somewhere above them on the ridgeline, a man who fought like the mountains fight, by making the terrain itself decide the outcome. The town came into view ahead of them. She kept her eyes on it and rode. Missoula smelled like river water and sawdust, and the particular density of a town that had more people in it than Hellgate by a factor of 10, and Emily rode into it beside Jim Creighton, with her back straight, and her face showing everything it showed, and her hands steady on the reins. The Territorial Land Office was where Cole said it would be north end of Main Street. Brick building, a flag moving in the morning wind above the door. Emily tied the bay at the post, and Jim tied his sorrel, and they went in together, and the clerk behind the front desk looked up and took in Emily's face and Jim's road-worn appearance, and said nothing about either. "We need to speak with whoever is handling the Creighton land appeal," Emily said. "Filed yesterday by a man named Aldred." "That matter is pending review," the clerk said. "The board doesn't convene until—" "I have testimony material to the case," Emily said. "Testimony that cannot wait for the board's schedule." The clerk looked at her, looked at Jim, looked back at Emily. "Your name, ma'am?" "Emily Carter Hargrove," she said. "Victor Hargrove's wife." The clerk's expression shifted in a way that told her Victor's name was known here, and not only known, but weighted, and she watched the man make his calculation and held his gaze while he made it. "Wait here," he said. They waited 20 minutes. Jim stood at the window and said nothing, and Emily sat in the straight-back chair against the wall and breathed with the deliberate steadiness of someone managing something large. Her cheek ached. Her legs ached from the ride. She had been awake since 4 in the morning, and the edges of everything had that particular sharpness that came from exhaustion, running alongside something too urgent to let you stop. "You don't have to do this," Jim said without turning from the window. "I know," Emily said. "Victor will come after you legally. He's got the money for it." "I know that too." Jim turned then and looked at her. He was a man who had worked his land alone since his wife died 6 years ago, and his face had the particular quality of someone who had learned to read weather and terrain and the honest condition of things, and had no interest in pretending otherwise. "Why?" he said. "You could have gotten to Missoula and kept going, Colorado, Wyoming. He'd have a harder time finding you the farther you got." Emily thought about the letter in Madeline's book, the sum of money written in precise handwriting, the named adjudicator, the lawyer on a road who had been supposed to be in the wrong place. "Because it's not just your land," she said. "It's the water, the 3 families on the North Corridor. It's the way he does it, clean on paper and visible, and everyone who knows looks the other way, because looking away is easier." She paused. "I looked away for 3 years. I'm done with that." Jim looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. The way men in this territory nodded when they had nothing to add because everything necessary had been said. The clerk came back. Behind him was a man in a gray suit with the careful, contained manner of someone who spent his days measuring the weight of claims. He stopped in front of Emily and looked at her face without commenting on it, which she was beginning to understand was its own kind of testimony. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "I'm Thomas Reed. I'm the senior review officer for this district. My clerk says you have material testimony regarding the Creighton appeal." "Yes," Emily said, "and I need to know something before I give it." Reed waited. "Is Everett Collis connected to this office?" Something moved in Reed's face. Small and fast and completely controlled, but Emily had spent 3 years reading the small, fast movements in controlled faces, and she did not miss it. "Mr. Collis is a land office liaison in this district," Reed said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Because I need to know whether what I tell you stays in this room or gets back to my husband before it gets to the board," Emily said. "And the answer to that depends on Mr. Collis." The room was very quiet. "Come into my office," Reed said. Stunned, she told him everything, not with emotion she had learned over 3 years of managing her own survival. That emotion in a room with authority was the thing that got discounted first. She told it the way she had learned to do everything that mattered precisely in order with the specific details that made the difference between a story and a statement. The letter in Madeline's book, the date on it, the name of the adjudicator, the sum of money and the language describing its purpose, the 2 men in Victor's parlor discussing a lawyer on a road, the sheriff's relationship with Victor documented in specific instances over 3 years. Reed wrote. He wrote everything and asked clarifying questions in a voice that gave away nothing, and Emily answered them all. When she finished, he set his pen down and looked at what he'd written and was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "what you've described, if it's accurate, constitutes interference with a territorial legal proceeding, attempted intimidation of an officer of the court, and bribery of a public official. He paused. It also constitutes, I'll note, a significant personal risk to yourself. Your husband will dispute everything you've said. I know, Emily said. The board will need to verify. That takes time. During that time, you cannot safely return to Hellgate. I'm not going back to Hellgate, Emily said. Reed looked at her steadily. Is there anything else you can provide? Any physical evidence to support the affidavit? Emily thought about the letter. Thought about Madeline sitting at the kitchen table composing it precise and deliberate. Thought about Madeline stopping in the kitchen last night and saying do it while you still have the choice, and picking up her coffee cup and going upstairs. There's a letter, Emily said. In a book in the east guest room of the Hargrove house. Whether it's still there, I can't say. But it exists, and if someone who knows what they're looking for, that requires authorization, Reed said, which requires the board to convene, which requires... He stopped. He picked up his pen and set it down again. He appeared to be thinking something through that was costing him something. There is, he said slowly, a federal provision under the Territorial Land Protection Act that allows for emergency preservation of evidence in active cases of suspected land fraud. It requires my signature and one other officer of the court. Aldred, Jim said from the doorway where he'd been standing silent. Reed looked at him. You'd need Mr. Aldred's countersignature, yes. He's in this building, Jim said. I saw him in the hall when we came in. Another quiet. Reed picked up his pen. Mrs. Hargrove, he said, I'm going to need you to sign this affidavit. She signed it. The second twist came at noon in the form of Cole Maddox walking into the land office with a man Emily had never seen, lean middle-aged, with a federal marshal's badge on his coat, and the road-worn look of someone who had been riding since before sunrise. Emily stood up from the bench in the hallway, where she'd been waiting, while Reed and Aldred worked through the authorization paperwork, and Cole looked at her, and something in his expression shifted from the focused, moving toward the objective quality it always had, into something briefly, quietly different. You got here, he said. You doubted it, Emily said. No, he said. And the plainness of it, no qualification, no softening went through her the way his directness always did. He turned to the marshal. This is Emily Carter Hargrove. She's filed the affidavit. The marshal looked at Emily's face with the same undemonstrative attention that Reed had brought to it. Ma'am, I'm Marshal David Holt, Federal Circuit. Mr. Maddox contacted my office 2 weeks ago with preliminary information about land fraud activity in the Bitterroot Valley. Your affidavit this morning provides the evidentiary foundation we've needed. He paused. With your cooperation and Mr. Reed's authorization, I'll be riding to Hellgate this afternoon. Emily looked at Cole. 2 weeks ago. I told you I'd been watching 6 months, he said. At some point, watching turns into preparing. You planned this. I planned for several possibilities, he said. You were the one who made this particular one happen. Emily looked at him and thought about 7 words on a piece of paper in Walt Penny's Trading Post, and the difference between a man who watches and a woman who acts, and how those two things had found each other in the dark on a mountainside, and made something neither of them could have made alone. What happens now? She said. Now, Cole said, we wait for the board, and we let the marshal do what marshals do. The board convened the next morning. Emily slept the night before in a room at the Missoula Hotel that cost more than she'd ever spent on a single night, and that she paid for with her own money from her own pocket, and found when she lay down on the bed in the quiet of a room that no one else had a key to, that she was too tired to think and too alert to stop, and that the combination of those two things eventually resolved itself into the deepest sleep she'd had in 3 years. She woke at 6 and dressed and went downstairs and found Cole at a table in the hotel's dining room with coffee and the particular quality of wakefulness that suggested he'd been up for some time. She sat down across from him. Reed got the authorization, Cole said. Marshal Holt rode to Hellgate last night with 2 deputies. He'll be looking for the letter. Madeline might have moved it, Emily said. She might. She might have destroyed it. She might have, Cole said, but she also might not have. There are women who keep their own evidence even when it's dangerous to keep it. Insurance against outcomes they didn't plan for. Emily thought about Madeline's voice in the kitchen. Do it while you still have the choice. The exhaustion underneath the precision. 50 years of managing impossible situations with the tools available to women in impossible situations, which were mostly information and patience, and the strategic deployment of both. She kept it, Emily said. She wasn't certain, but she said it with the certainty of one woman reading another across a distance of 30 years and very different circumstances. She kept it. Cole looked at her over his coffee cup. I think so too, he said. They sat in a silence that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that two people share when they have been through something large together and have not yet had the occasion to exist in each other's company without that large thing requiring their immediate attention. After this, Emily said, what do you do? He turned his cup in his hands. Depends how it resolves. If the board finds in Creighton's favor and the federal case moves forward, there'll be a proceeding. They'll need testimony. That takes time. And if they don't need you... He looked at her. Then I go where I go next. Where is that? I don't know yet. He paused. What do you do after? Emily considered this. It was the first time she had considered it without the weight of the immediate situation pressing down on the question, and the absence of that weight made the question larger rather than smaller. She had no house. She had the money in her pocket, and a signed affidavit, and a name, her own name Carter, the name she'd been born with, and the fact of herself here, sitting at a table in Missoula, having done several things that 3 years ago she would not have believed she was capable of doing. I don't know either, she said. I think that's the first time in a long time that not knowing feels like a choice instead of a trap. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, there's work in the valley. After Victor's holdings get untangled by the federal process, some of those properties will need management. Legal management by people who know the land. He was very careful with his voice. Jim Creighton's mentioned he needs help with the North Ridge documentation. You're suggesting I stay in Hellgate, Emily said. I'm suggesting you do whatever you decide to do, he said. I'm just noting what exists in the vicinity of that decision. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that full, unguarded attention that she had found both times she'd encountered it to be simultaneously the most comfortable and most unsettling thing about him. A man who looked at you without protecting himself from what he might see. Are you in the vicinity of that decision? Emily said. The question arrived simpler than she'd intended it, with less of the careful framing she might have put around it if she'd planned it, and she let it sit there because it was honest, and she was done with the other kind. Cole set his cup down. Yes, he said, if you want me to be. No performance, no elaboration, just the word laid down like a hand extended across a table. Take it or don't, it's yours to decide. Emily looked at it for a moment. Then she said, all right. The board convened at 9 o'clock in a room that smelled of wood polish and official paper, and Emily sat beside Aldred and Jim Creighton, and gave her testimony again, this time, formally, in front of 5 men whose job was to decide what the evidence weighed. Victor arrived at 10:30. She heard him in the corridor before the door opened, that particular cadence, that particular force of contained anger that she had catalogued over 3 years in this house, and that arrived now in a public room and was smaller in it than it had ever been anywhere he'd existed in her life. He came in with a lawyer from Missoula and stopped when he saw her, and his face did several things in quick succession that she watched with a clarity made possible by the fact that she was sitting in a chair in a room full of witnesses, and he could not do anything about any of them. He sat down on the other side of the room. His lawyer began to speak, and Emily watched Victor's face while he spoke, and understood within 3 minutes that the lawyer did not know about the letter. Victor had not told his lawyer about the letter because Victor had believed the letter was safe in a book in a room in his house, and what the lawyer was presenting was a case built on the assumption that no physical evidence existed. The door opened. Marshal Holt came in and handed a sealed envelope to Thomas Reed, and Reed opened it and read it, and the color of his expression changed. Victor saw this. Emily watched him see it. Reed looked up. "The board will take a short recess," he said. The recess lasted 40 minutes. Emily sat in the hallway with Jim and Aldred and did not speak and did not need to. Cole was somewhere outside. He had not come into the hearing room, which was correct. His role was not the hearing room, and his absence was a specific kind of presence that Emily recognized the shape of. When the board reconvened, Reed set the envelope on the table in front of him. "The board has received under Federal Emergency Preservation Authorization a physical document recovered from the Hargrove residence in Hellgate, Montana this morning." He paused. "I'll note for the record that this document was recovered from its location with the cooperation of a Madeline Hargrove, who offered it voluntarily to Marshal Holt upon his arrival." Emily closed her eyes for half a second. She kept it, and then she gave it up. She thought about Madeline at the kitchen table composing that letter all those weeks ago. Thought about the calculation that a woman like Madeline would have been running for years, the specific arithmetic of a woman embedded in a powerful man's business, knowing what she knew, keeping her insurance waiting for a moment when the risk calculation tipped. Victor had pushed too far. He had pushed past land fraud and tax manipulation into ordering a man's death on a road. And Madeline Hargrove, who had survived 50 years by knowing exactly where the line was, had watched him step over it and made her own decision. Victor's lawyer said something sharp. Victor said something sharper. Reed allowed none of it. "Mr. Hargrove," Reed said, and his voice had the quality of a door being closed. "The board will be referring this matter to the Federal Circuit Court in Helena. Marshal Holt has outstanding questions for you regarding an incident on the Missoula Road on Thursday. I suggest you speak with your counsel before responding to anything further today." Victor stood. His face was the face of a man who had hit the boundary of what his money and influence could manage and was feeling for possibly the first time the specific sensation of that boundary being real. He looked across the room at Emily. She met his eyes and did not arrange her expression into anything. She let him see what was there. Not triumph. Nothing like triumph, but the plain and undecorated face of a woman who had simply stopped being available for what he required of her. He looked away first. His lawyer took his arm, and they left the room. Jim Creighton was standing in the hallway when Emily came out, and he took off his hat and held it and looked at her and said, "My wife would have liked you." And that was all, and it was enough. She found Cole outside, standing at the corner of the building in the noon light, and she walked up to him and stopped, and they stood together on the boardwalk of Missoula, Montana, in the summer of a year that would turn out to be the one that changed things, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "The letter was there," Emily said. "Madeline gave it to Holt herself," Cole said. "He told me before he went in?" "She made her own choice." "People do," Cole said, "when the window opens." Emily looked at the street. The ordinary traffic of a territorial town going about its business wagons, and horses, and men on foot, and women with market baskets, all of it moving with the particular indifferent continuity of ordinary life that had been continuing without interruption. The entire time, Emily Carter Hargrove had been living inside 4 walls in a house north of Hellgate, believing that the world outside those walls was inaccessible to her. "I need to find a lawyer," she said, "for the separation. Victor will fight it." "He will," Cole said. "He doesn't have the same leverage he had yesterday, but he's still a man with money, and that counts for something." "I know," she breathed. "I'm not afraid of a fight. I used to be. I'm not anymore." Cole looked at her. That direct, unguarded look. "No," he said. "You're not." She turned and faced him fully. This man who had spent 6 months watching a valley from the high timber because he had decided some things needed to be stood in front of. Who had put a federal marshal's name in motion 2 weeks before she'd left 7 words with Walt Penny? Who had walked out of the tree line in the dark and said, "Give her left rein without preamble or explanation," because it was the necessary thing, and he did necessary things without requiring them to be acknowledged. "You said you go where you go next," Emily said. "I did say that." And you said you were in the vicinity of my decision. I did say that too. Cole. She said his name the way he had said hers, once plainly fixing it. I'm going to be in Hellgate for at least the length of a federal proceeding. I'm going to need to know the high timber above the Creighton land because I'm going to be helping Jim with the Northridge documentation. And I'm going to be, for the first time in 3 years, a woman making her own choices about where she goes and who she goes there with. He was very still. Are you asking me something? He said. I'm telling you something, she said. I've spent 3 years asking permission for everything. I'm not asking for this. She held his eyes. I'm telling you that I want you in the vicinity. Permanently. If that suits you. Something moved across Cole Maddox's face, something that had been held back with the same economy he applied to everything, and that arrived now in the noon light on a Missoula street with the specific weight of something true. Not a performance, not a response to a social cue. Just a man looking at a woman who had walked out of an impossible situation on her own feet, and was now telling him plainly what she wanted. It suits me, he said. She nodded once. He nodded once. And between those two nods was everything that had been built in the dark on a mountainside, and in a general store, and in 7 words on a piece of paper. All of it acknowledged and settled and made real in the simple mutual language of 2 people who had both learned the hard way to say what was true and mean it. They walked back into the land office together, and behind them, the summer street continued its ordinary and extraordinary business. And ahead of them was a federal proceeding and a separation lawsuit, and the long work of whatever came after survival. And Emily Carter walked into all of it, with her head up, and her face showing everything. It showed not arranged, not managed, not performing the expression of a woman who required nothing. Her own face in her own light going where she decided to go. That was the beginning, and it was also finally and completely the end of what Victor Hargrove had taken 3 years trying to make her.